The Louisiana Slave Revolt in New Orleans of 1811, also known as the German Coast Uprising, developed because the enslaved people living on plantations outside the city of New Orleans wanted to be free and have their own rights like all other Americans had, and no longer be enslaved. However, it was the plantations owners' perceived responsibility to keep them in check and prevent the enslaved people from having rights. But they revolted with large numbers, leading to one of the largest slave revolts in history. This revolt is a major transfiguration in history as well, because it led to their freedom from slavery, with the Amendments 13 being the one to abolish slavery, and 14 and 15 being the ones to grant enslaved people the right to vote and equal freedoms in the year 1865 when the Civil War came to an end, though they were not successful in their generation.
January 8th, 1811, outside the city, about 500 enslaved people gathered around on the grounds of the Manuel Andre plantation, receiving a short, encouraging speech from their leader, Charles Deslandes. Deslandes' goal was to burn every house outside of New Orleans, then take New Orleans for himself and the other enslaved people, while building his army on the way to make their forces intimidating.
Before this event began, Charles Deslandes had well planned the Louisiana Slave Revolt. This revolt wasn't his first revolt either. He participated in the Haitian Revolution in Haiti, which was the most successful slave revolt because the slaves there actually won their freedom from it.
The first target that gained Deslandes' army most of their other weapons, new militia uniforms, and more ammunition was Manuel Andre plantation. There, the army killed Manuel's son, Gilbert Andre, and nearly killed Andre, but he escaped to a boat he had in a nearby river. The new uniforms Deslandes knew would lead the army authority over the revolt.
After the attack at Manuel Andre's mansion and the gaining of more supplies, the army began a 2-day march down the river road that led straight to New Orleans. During this 2-day period of time, the enslaved people burned the homes of white planters and the home of the local doctor, struggling to succeed most of the time due to the rain that was pouring most of the trip. The enslaved army also gained 2 more leaders, Cook and Coamana, both fierce, powerful enslaved people that recruited people to build their own army but ended up joining with Deslandes' army.
Outside the city of New Orleans, a small group of equestrians came to the news that the army was marching rapidly towards the city. Later, this news was spread to the governor, Governor Claiborne. He also heard of traffic jams 9 miles long, so he assumed the army was huge compared to the city's army. Since everybody in the city ran in fear and panic, not knowing how large the forces were, he said that the best thing to do was request help from President Jefferson. Not long after, his top general, Wade Hampton, arrived, offering his assistance in fighting the revolt with a small army. This gave hope to Claiborne, so he ordered many of his own troops around. Then to add to this, some militia that lived in the city decided to fight alongside the newly forming army.
Deslandes' army, as they moved closer toward New Orleans, had gained more enslaved people and some horses, enough to support half the army, but what they had not gained was enough weapons for even half the army. So this made the army very weak. If Deslandes had any chance of surviving, they needed not so much as people, but more weapons to supply their army.
Unfortunately for the enslaved army, on January 10th, they were met by some of the troops from New Orleans. And to make matters worse, when they began to retreat from these troops, they encountered another army, the militia army. With the 2 armies on either side of the enslaved army was taken down with several enslaved people murdered viciously during the battle, resulting in a loss for Deslandes and his army.
The day after, January 11th, the enslaved army's forces were taken out. The other enslaved people that were rounded up were lined up and either were shot by a firing squad, or as most of them had it, they got their heads chopped off and put on wooden stakes that were lined up 60 miles long to warn any other enslaved people that if they were to attempt to revolt, the same would happen to them.
The slave revolt of New Orleans / the German Coast Uprising was significant because it was one of many large slave revolts in history. Enslaved people were treated unfairly and ended up losing, but not entirely. The others that didn't join were fortunate enough to have freedom about 50 years into the future, when President Lincoln abolished slavery after the Civil War, with the 13th Amendment and the 14th and 15th following after it. All other Americans may have thought that it was their responsibility to keep control of the enslaved people's rights, but this later was proved wrong with the abolishment of slavery.